Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear speakers and participants. I would like to welcome you to this first session of the Technical Expert Meeting on Mitigation event series on human settlements, sustainable low-emission housing and building solutions, technologies and design for buildings, housing and construction. I'm Martina Otto and I'm heading UNEP's work on cities and the Secretariat of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, or in short, Global ABC. I'll be emceeing the introduction to the series, which was put together by the Global ABC and the UNFCCC Secretariat. After this, we'll directly go into the first session, Cool Buildings for All, for which we have teamed up with the Cool Coalition, a partnership that addresses the different cooling challenges, and whose secretariat is, just as the one of the Global ABC, also housed by UNEP. But before we get started, I would like to inform you that the session will be recorded. And I remind you to kindly keep your microphones muted. The objective of the series is to share low-emission housing and building solutions, from technologies to policies and processes, and to build a community that drives and implements an ambitious vision of zero carbon buildings by 2050. We are proposing 3 themes. The first, as I mentioned already, Cool Buildings for All. The second, mobilizing the value chain towards circular economy, and the third, developing pathways for moving to scale. The first 2, because they constitute trends that require attention, as they could undo energy efficiency efforts being made, as we see the floor space doubling by 2050, which comes with demands for materials and related embodied carbon, and as we see climate change-induced heat waves driving up cooling demand, and calling for more than improving energy efficiency of mechanical cooling, following the avoid, shift, improve approach by also harnessing better building design, as well as district cooling and use of renewable energy. At the same time, both building energy efficiency renovation and the creation of more local value chains based on circularity approaches do have the potential to create more local jobs than most other sectors while improving living conditions. And that at a time when the COVID-19 pandemic has led to economic downturn and has come on top of a housing crisis. The third session will look at how to get us to scale through long-term strategies and effective roadmaps to put the sector on a Paris Agreement compliant path. Each session will garner recommendations to policymakers, which will be summarized at the end and brought back to the policy and negotiation processes. So we really encourage you to join us also in the next sessions on the 7th and the 14th of October. The program is designed to be interactive, as we could not meet in person due to the situation, and it's very unfortunate, but we'll make the best of it, and we'll be using polling via Mentimeter, and we'll be collecting questions from the audience, asking you to use the chat box. So now let me introduce you to Roland Hunziker and James Grabert for their welcoming remarks. Roland is the Director of Sustainable Buildings and Cities at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the co-chair of the Global ABC Steering Committee. And James is the Director of the Mitigation Division at the UNFCCC Secretariat. This will be followed by a keynote by Marianne Carlsen from Norway, and she is the chair of the subsidiary body of for implementation. So Roland, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Martina. And dear participants, it is a great pleasure for me to welcome you all on behalf of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, Global ABC, to this series of virtual meetings. It's a very important topic on how we get to net zero buildings by 2050. As Martina said, I'm Roland Hunziker at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and I mainly look after our work on sustainable buildings and cities. I co-chair the steering committee of the Global ABC together with Yvonne Lynch of the Ministry of Ecological and Inclusive Transition of France. We created the Global ABC during the COP21 in order to put the building sector more firmly on the agenda of the climate negotiations, since this is such a crucial sector if we want to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. We are starting to get used to saying that this sector accounts for almost 40% of global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions, and this is a very important number. It includes the emissions from operating our buildings, particularly heating and cooling, but also the emissions from the construction process, including the emissions embodied in materials. The problem we're facing is that this number does not go down. We have been seeing improvements in energy efficiency over the last decade, but the floor area growth has outpaced these improvements year on year. We're building approximately the area of Paris every year. So the Global ABC serves as an umbrella initiative for many organizations to come together so that we coordinate, we collaborate to achieve our vision of a net zero emissions built environment by 2050. Today, Global ABC is made up of well over 100 organizations, of which 30 national governments. What I would like to stress ahead of these 3 expert meetings is that we will need all solutions to change this sector and that we need to move fast. Very importantly, and especially now with the experience of the pandemic, we need to rethink what we need to build, what we can reuse, and how we use our buildings more flexibly. Then we need to build for energy efficiency, but we also need to build lighter so we can reduce the amount of materials that are needed in the construction. For us at the WBCSD, it's critical that we engage more with the demand side on these issues. This means the owners, the developers, the financiers, but also the cities, who are those who make the decisions about how projects are carried out. At this moment, the carbon performance of buildings does not yet show up in their decision-making process, and we need to work on that. At WBCSD, we issued this year the Building System Carbon Framework, which provides a common language that allows all the actors along the full value chain to collaborate to achieve this common vision. We're now engaging with all these actors to develop the tools and guidance that they need to act and also learn how they can benefit from this action. So I look forward to the discussions in these 3 meetings and the insights that we will generate. And I hope that our interactions will also continue thereafter. Thank you very much. And with this, I am handing over to you, James, to take us through the next step. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Martina. On behalf of the UNFCCC Secretariat, I would like to thank you and your team at the Global ABC for your excellent support in co-organizing this year's technical expert meeting on mitigation, which over the next 3 weeks will address the critical issues of sustainability and emissions profile of the building sector. Based on the inclusion of the sector in over 130 NDCs and also on the risk of long-term lock-in of emission pathways, this topic had been selected for consideration in 2020, well before the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the pandemic has also given many of us a moment to reflect on our relationships with buildings, as our homes have been repurposed as schools and offices, and our schools and offices are being reimagined.
James, I don't know whether that's a problem that only I have, but we can't hear you anymore.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm back, I hope.
Yes, you are.
Try again. All right. However, the pandemic has also given many of us a moment to reflect on our relationships with buildings, as our homes have been repurposed as schools and offices, and our schools and offices are being reimagined and redesigned to account for the evolving needs of the post-COVID world. Access to quality and appropriate housing to manage the spread of the virus is one of the many inequalities that the pandemic has exposed. Climate change is having and will continue to have an even more dramatic impact on our relationship with buildings, which must shelter us from ever more extreme and variable climatic conditions. This essential human development and need must also be achieved while minimizing the emissions footprints of buildings in both their construction and use phases. A challenge of this scale can only be addressed by intensive multi-stakeholder engagement to understand and include the needs of building users, real estate owners and managers, urban planners, the construction industry, including specialized labor and policymakers at various levels. Each of these groups and more have unique insights, perspective, and challenges that must be understood to make effective policy. Our hope is that this event and the reports and technical papers produced afterwards can inspire policymakers to move from recognizing the potential contribution of the sector to climate action to implementing the necessary policies to enable this action to be taken at pace at scale required by the science. The UNFCCC Secretariat looks forward to taking stock of the outcomes of this meeting with the aim of better supporting parties' implementation efforts through our regional collaboration centers and through more targeted and intensive policymaker engagement. We also hope that the outcomes of these meetings can enable the support institutions of the UNFCCC, including those of the financial.
James, I think we've lost you again. I think every time someone joins, the voice goes.
I think that's what's happening. Yeah, exactly. I was just saying, though, I'm almost done. The meetings can enable support institutions of the UNFCCC, including those of the financial and technology mechanisms, to target their activities in support of countries' needs and the highest impact mitigation actions. So I wish you all a very success in this discussion today and in the next 2 weeks, and trust that this virtual setting will enable greater global participation and will also provide for interaction among various stakeholder perspectives. I'm looking forward to the discussions, and hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James, and also Roland, for your welcoming remarks and for highlighting how important it is that well, the policies are in place to help us drive the transformation in the sector that is needed to go forward. But we've been joined now as well by Marianne Carlsen, and I introduced you briefly already. Well, you're the chair of SBI. And have a lot of experience from driving the policies in Norway as well. And please share with us your vision for strengthening the building sector engagement towards the Paris Agreement and the race to zero in 2050. And we thank you very much for being with us this morning.
Thank you very much. I had some connectivity challenges just now, but I hope that you both can see me and hear me well. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. I've already been introduced, but I am Marianne Carlsen. I'm the chair of the SBI, and you see me in my living room in a small town outside Oslo in Norway. I am very pleased to be speaking here at the opening of the Global Technical Expert Meeting on Mitigation, and would also like to associate Tosi Mpanupanu, the chair of SUBSTA, to this address. I hope that you and your families are well and healthy during these challenging times. While COVID-19 rightfully takes our attention, the urgency of addressing climate change is as important as it was when 2020 started. The urgency of addressing climate change has not gone away. We cannot be complacent, but continue to pursue and ramp up ambition and action on climate change. Under the UNFCCC, we must continue to work, and although virtual settings may not be ideal, we are making progress in the only format we currently have. Let me extend my sincere gratitude for those of you whom are linking up to this event from locations where connectivity remains a challenge, and for those in time zones, which would mean that you should have been spending time now with your family and friends, or even have been sleeping. Recent studies confirm that recovery efforts must be aligned with the Paris goals if we want to reach them. Infrastructure and buildings constitute a central part in many recovery packages. At the same time, infrastructure and buildings remain a key source of emissions. It is therefore of particular importance that this year TEM-M focus on sustainable low-emission housing and building solutions and how we can achieve the vision of zero carbon buildings by 2050. Under the current circumstances, I am also particularly pleased that the TEMs are becoming increasingly focused on specific policy and technology issues needed to scale up immediate implementation with long-term impacts. Buildings play an essential role in limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees and is critical to maintain the warming well below 2 degrees. As already mentioned here today, buildings are key drivers for energy demand and emissions. And buildings today, they last for decades. Hence, they also harbor a high risk of lock-in of high emissions. At the same time, the building sector is a key economic sector and employing as much as up to 12% of the workforce in many countries. Our buildings are massive, untapped opportunities and potential to address climate change, increase prosperity, and clean up our air. With development and modernization, the number of new buildings will continue to rise. This rapid growth will challenge the target of 30% energy intensity improvement in buildings by 2030, which the global ABC consider as needed to put the sector on track to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. It is evident that under the current scenarios, we will not be able to meet the vision of a zero carbon buildings by 2050. So business as usual is not an option. We must work harder to build back better. In the next days, you will be focusing on concrete challenges, opportunities to curb emissions by identifying solutions across value chains and by different actors. To talk a little bit around the program you have in front of you. Space cooling is the topic of the first day of the TEM. The construction materials, the energy source used to cool the space are few of the areas which will impact the carbon footprint of buildings. Selecting the most environmental friendly will need government and public support via policy interventions, consumer awareness, capacity building of workers, amongst others. During the day 2, you will focus on building back better, or building better. Mobilizing the value chain towards circular economy, and the third day we'll discuss the topic developing pathways for moving to scale. These discussions among experts will showcase stories and success stories to all stakeholders and inspire for action. Parties to the Paris Agreement outline their commitments and communicate their national determined contributions and long-term low emission development strategies. These are commitments that can identify areas for building sustainably and developing policies that encourage low emission infrastructure development. The outcomes of the regional and global TEMs, along with the technical paper, will be published at the end of the year and will contribute to the summary for policymakers at COP26 next year. Therefore, your participation at this meeting to increase awareness and build momentum to encourage green buildings, discuss best practices and policies will contribute substantially. We all, in our respective roles as decision makers, manufacturers, consumers, all play a crucial role, and together we will make difference. Lastly, I know it has been challenging times for everyone, and I hope these times will open up for more opportunities as the time passes. We must learn from the past experiences and build more sustainable and environmental friendly. I wish you a successful meeting and trust that you will be able to attend all 3 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marianne, for your inspiring words and for highlighting the urgency of the transformation in this sector. And this global TEM comes after a series of 4 regional technical expert meetings on mitigation, which were held between 19th and 27th of August. And we have Mirir Mohammed Huni, the chair of the Technology Executive Committee, who will give us a short summary of this. And that's already our lead into the cooling session, because the technical meetings at the regional level did really focus on this challenge. Please, Mirir.
Thank you, Martina, and I hope everyone is well and healthy. At the outset, let me thank the UNFCCC Secretariat and the Global Alliance on Building and Construction for having both the Technology Executive Committee as well as the Climate Technology and Center Network to report on the outcomes of the regional TEM-Ms that we have organized last August. We had, as mentioned, we had 4 regional TEM-Ms on the topic of climate smart cooling solution for sustainable buildings. These were held in Africa, in Latin America, Caribbean, Asia and the Pacific, Europe, Eastern Europe and West Asia as well. And special thanks goes to the UNFCCC Regional Collaboration Centers who have immensely contributed and the global ABC for support in this effort. We had, as mentioned, 4 rounds of intense and fruitful and successful discussions in and around climate smart cooling solutions, where the inputs from the panelists from different variety of stakeholders and regions were converged on an urgency to accelerate actions to meet the increasing energy demand for building sector, particularly focusing on the energy needs for space cooling, as rightly articulated by everyone before me. And just to provide a report back from the major takeaways that from the presentation and the debates that occurred during the regional TEM-Ms, I will summarize in 4 bullets. So the first bullet will be the climate smart cooling technology innovations were available and can deliver multiple core benefits in addition to the greenhouse gas reduction. So a great deal of is happening in and around the different regions in terms of design and implementation of technology solutions. So efforts are on the put and the diffusion of innovative energy given to the use of green construction materials, indigenous building techniques that prevent solar heat gains. So on the second one, which is there's an inclusive approach encouraged. Meaning creativity and the actions also took and addressing broader issues such as equality in terms of access to cooling for all communities, green job creations and provision of more opportunities, health and building indigenous and endogenous capacities. Such inclusive approach is a key success of every program. Thirdly, having the access to right financial mechanisms or tools have accelerated the actual implementation of the projects, particularly on sustainable cooling solutions. For example, innovative financial mechanisms such as the Japan joint credit mechanism and sustainable financing instruments such as Kenya Green Bond Program are examples that were mentioned during our meetings, and it's indicated that they are fundamental to support the transmission of towards climate smart cooling solution. Microfinancing is also an important tool and has it ensured that wide diffusion of climate technologies are readily available. Fourthly, the right policy drives that require change on the ground. In other words, governments plays a critical role in putting place of policies, minimum energy performances, standard and labeling schemes that incentivize the adoption of energy efficient and sustainable cooling solutions for buildings. Efficient governance tools such as Brazilian AC labeling program, Rwanda Green Building Compliance System, CODO system and code can deliver the transition faster and quicker and efficiently. National and local governments' roles are also a key factor that leads in the planning and consultation processes, like in the case of India Cooling Action Plan. In summary, factors for successful technology leapfrogging in cool solutions include cost-efficient technological and financial support, as well as establishing right technological, right regional and national and municipal policy framework. Nonetheless, there's also needs to have a long-term and continuous capacity building program accompanying every stakeholder in the chain. Distinguished participants, let me close by highlighting what Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, mentioned during the last conference of the parties in Madrid, that we are collectively need a rapid and deep change in the way we do in business, how we generate power, how we move, how we feed the world, and how we build cities. The Technology Executive Committee, CTCM, is ready to assist parties and non-parties stakeholders to contribute to this vision through our policy and implementation work on smart cooling solutions. I thank you. Thank you very much.
Martina, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm muted. Sorry, thank you. Thank you so much, Maria, for the reporting back of the rich debate that came out of the regional events. I think this is an excellent teaser for our session now, and we will come back to a lot of the points that you did raise throughout the discussion and be able to drill deeper. And with that, let us proceed directly to this first session of the global TEM-M, Cool Buildings for All. And I would like to hand over to our moderator, Marion, who is an international broadcaster, a media trainer and communication specialist. And throughout her career, she has focused on environmental issues, particularly biodiversity and climate change. And she joins us virtually from Montreal, Canada. Marion, please take us through this first session. It's an early start for you.
Thank you very much, Martina, for your opening of the meeting and for your kind introduction. And I also wanted to say a big thanks to Global ABC and to the Cool Coalition, who collaborated to organize this session together with the UNFCCC. You've done an amazing job and you've had so much work. Now, a warm welcome to all of you again who are joining us from around the world, and that includes our 6 expert panelists for this first session of the TEM-M 2020 with the theme, as we have heard, Cool Buildings for All. As our planet heats up, so does demand for cooling our homes and buildings, especially in the developing world, which often has the most need for cooling but the least access. How do we satisfy the growing demand for cooling our homes and buildings? And while trying to meet the target of zero-emission buildings by 2050? And how do we make sure that during the post-COVID economic recovery, governments investing in the building sector send those resources in a climate-friendly direction? These are some of the questions that our expert panelists will touch on in the next 30 minutes as they share their insights on cooling trends, challenges, and solutions. And they'll certainly demonstrate that cooling is more than just ramping up air conditioning. Then in the second half of this session, it's your turn, our audience, to speak. First, in an interactive Q&A, we'll ask you to send us your questions and your comments via the chat panel on your screen. You'll see it on the right-hand side, and you can do this throughout the session. When possible, I'd also like to ask you to direct your questions to a specific speaker or speakers. As part of that Q&A, we'll also invite you to participate in an online poll using a tool called Mentimeter, which some of you may be familiar with, and we'll give you that logon information during the Q&A segment. And I may add, I would like to urge you to participate because your input is so valuable to the TEM-M process and to this climate discussion. Because as we've heard, the outcomes from this meeting will inform important recommendations made to policymakers, and your voice does make a difference. And now, speaking of voices, it's time to turn to our panel of experts. I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, who will set the stage or lay the building blocks, as it were, for today's theme and for the other topics by outlining general trends and responses to the growing demand for cooling around the world. Let me introduce Dr. Gabrielle Dreyfus. She's a senior scientist at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development, chief science advisor for the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program. Gabrielle is a trained climate scientist with over a decade of experience working on climate and clean energy in the US government and with civil society. She recently co-authored the UNEP and International Energy Agency Cooling Emissions and Policy Synthesis Report, and she's also a member of the Technical Review Committee of the Global Cooling Prize, something that our cooling experts might want to take note of. She joins us now from Washington, DC. Gabrielle, a big welcome. Please unmute yourself, make sure your camera is on, and the microphone is now yours.
Thank you, Marion, and thank you to everyone for the introductions for this very important discussion. It's my pleasure to provide framing and context for why cooling demand in buildings is critical to meeting our climate and development objectives. According to the 2020 United in Science report, there is a 1 in 5 chance that we will exceed 1.5 C before 2024. Together, this warming, together with growing populations, incomes and urbanization, is driving a rapid increase in demand for cooling. In fact, in the next 10 years, we are on track to add 1 billion more room air conditioners to our current stock and another 3.5 billion by 2050. That's about 3 ACs being installed every second. As we electrify our buildings, I expect that reversible ACs, or heat pumps, that demand will continue to drive these numbers even higher. As a result, overall global energy use for air conditioning will triple, adding almost as much electricity demand for cooling alone as the entire US generated in 2018. Yes, that's as much electricity as one of the highest energy consuming and emitting countries in the world. Furthermore, as demand for electricity increases, so does the gap in access to cooling, an injustice that it can increase health risks and heighten vulnerability. Sustainable Energy for All finds that over 1 billion people currently lack access to sustainable cooling, and a further 2.2 billion are burdened by costly and polluting inefficient cooling technologies. These are among the reasons that the International Energy Agency calls cooling a blind spot in the energy and climate debate. I consider getting cooling right both the greatest challenge and the greatest opportunity for climate and development. That's because if we continue to cool ourselves as we have with the same inefficient technologies and super greenhouse gas refrigerants, we will blow through the 1.5 C in no time. But there is good news. We have the solutions and the policy drivers to get cooling right. By taking advantage of the next refrigerant transition driven by the Montreal Protocol, we have the opportunity to transform how we cool. According to the recent UNEP and IEA cooling synthesis report that was released in July, adopting the best available technologies for energy efficient and climate friendly cooling could avoid between 210 and 460 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2060. That's equivalent to 8 years of current greenhouse gas global emissions. But as our speakers have noted, and our future panelists will describe in more detail, improving the cooling of equipment alone is not enough. An early and critical component is to reduce the cooling load in the first place by better designing our buildings and cities. Over the next 40 years, the global ABC projects that we're going to build 230 billion square meters in new construction. That's the equivalent to the area of Paris being built every week. Managing growth and cooling demand is also a key factor in maintaining electricity reliability and lowering costs of decarbonizing the electricity sector. Cooling demand drives peak electricity load, making up 50% or more of peak electricity demand during heat waves. Electricity generation and grids are sized to meet peak demand. Consider for a moment that more cooling capacity was added in 2018 in gigawatt terms than the total added solar generation capacity. As the other speakers will highlight, nature-based solutions, such as increasing urban forest canopies and smarter reflective surfaces, can reduce the effects of urban heat islands, which disproportionately impact vulnerable populations. Passive cooling and better building design, materials, and operations, including use of district heating and cooling, are also essential to reducing cooling demand. The Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program and the Cool Coalition will soon release a brief on the benefits of passive cooling. With this context, I would argue that getting cooling right requires a pathways approach. This begins with deploying available technologies with least climate impact now, as we develop the skills and know-how to adopt newer technologies and systems, together with improving urban and building design and operations. This includes using life cycle climate performance as a metric to identify the most climate-friendly solutions for a given context. Managing growth in cooling demand is critical to meeting climate objectives while also supporting pandemic and economic recovery. The UN Secretary General and others are calling for a green recovery that directs economic stimulus packages towards policies and programs that address pandemic and economic recovery sustainably. Efficient cooling in our buildings is a powerful green recovery strategy. A recent report by the Economist Intelligence Unit has identified the impacts of including energy efficiency within stimulus packages, such as enhanced job creation. Every $10 million spent in improved building efficiency generates 90 to 300 jobs. That's compared to 27 jobs in the fossil fuel sector for the same amount of spending. And there are additional multiplier effects from governments and consumers turning savings on energy bills into additional spending in the economy. And with that, I'd like to return to Marion. Thank you.
Gabrielle, thank you very much for your insights and for setting the stage for the other speaker topics today. Our next two panelists will talk about how building design can help us meet cooling needs, with a special focus on passive buildings and effective retrofits. It's my pleasure now to introduce Jessica Grove-Smith. She's a senior scientist and joint managing director at the Passivhaus Institute in Darmstadt, Germany. Her areas of expertise include energy efficient building solutions around the world, climate data for energy modeling, interrelations between efficiency and renewable energies, and deep energy efficiency for public indoor swimming pools, as well as passive house training. Jessica is a veteran of conferences internationally on technical and policy-related topics with regard to high-performance buildings. Jessica, a very warm welcome to you. And now let's dive right in. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Marianne, for the introduction. I'll just share my screen and my video. I hope you can all see me now, and my screen. 1 second. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, that's perfect, Jessica.
Perfect, thank you very much. Okay, Thank you, Marianne, again for the introduction, and thank you, Gabrielle, for setting the scene. I'm very excited to be here today at this technical meeting and very thankful for the opportunity to participate in this really important discussion, also with the other panelists on the topic of cool buildings for all. I work at the Passivhaus Institute. The Passivhaus Institute, we're based in Germany. We act internationally with partners around the world. And we are a research organization focused on developing solutions for high energy efficient buildings. So exactly as Gabrielle was just saying, we focus on optimizing buildings, designing in the way to keep the load low in the very first place. So buildings that provide comfortable and healthy living and working conditions, designed in the way that they need very little energy input for heating and cooling. And I want to just share with you briefly how the Passivhaus concept and the Passivhaus standard works. Before I dive into the details, I want to briefly reflect again on the context. The cooling needs are on a rise. That's why we're all here. We need solutions. That's what we're here to discuss. In order to be able to identify the best solutions for buildings, I want to briefly reflect a little bit on the context and where the increase for cooling is coming from. There are many, many factors that play into this, as we will hear throughout the session. Warming climate is clearly one. The climate is getting harsher and more difficult and hotter. But the other two aspects I briefly want to pick up on are population growth and urbanization, and also the trend of increase in living standards. And these two are important when we're looking at actually optimizing our building design. Due to the urbanization trends and the population growth, it means that more and more people are living in dense urban settings. And these dense urban city settings are especially challenging in terms of cooling, keeping our buildings comfortably cool. We have urban heat islands effect. There are many means to counteract those, but there are urban heat island effects. There's noise and there's air pollutions, and all these boundary conditions in the urban setting make it particularly challenging to implement passive cooling design, and they certainly impose limits on the potential for natural ventilation and free cooling. That's something we have to keep in mind as part of our design processes. And then furthermore, the context of living standards improving, that's great, that's a fantastic trend. But it also means that more and more people have access and can afford active cooling and will install air conditioning when they can. So what we see happening around the world, as you can see in this photograph here, the experience shows that people add air conditioning to their existing very inefficient buildings when they can afford it, increasing the cooling load with a very high environmental impact. These are very inefficient solutions. Experience also shows that when people do have access to cooling, they kind of move away from the adaptive comfort thresholds of temperatures up to 30 degrees in the building, but they prefer lower set points down to 25. And these lower set points really drive the high cooling need. This cannot be the way forward. Really need to make sure that we design buildings in a way from the beginning that the occupants feel comfortable from the outset without the need for without the need for installing inefficient air conditioning later on. So this ultimately is a design task. We need to look at our buildings as a whole and focus on these two aspects that I've mentioned here. So first of all, design task number one, efficiency first. And by that, I mean exactly, we have to make sure we look at the building as a whole. We have to optimize the shape, the orientation, and the components to make sure that we provide high quality and stable indoor temperatures with very little energy input needed. The second aspect, the second design task here is resilience. So what we urgently need to prevent are cooling peaks and insecurities in the energy supply, and we need to ensure long-term healthy and comfortable living conditions for everybody, also for the most vulnerable, especially them. So to give you a better idea of the kind of magnitude I'm talking about here in terms of energy savings, I've included this graph here of an example project in New Delhi that we modeled. You can see here at the top, the graph shows the, let me just turn on my pointer. You can see here at the top, this is the cooling demand that a building would need if it's built to current code, to current building standards. So the cooling demand for both sensible cooling and dehumidification is very high. If we build to high energy efficiency levels down to what we propose as the Passivhaus standard, we have energy savings for cooling of around 50 or 70% even. So significant savings just by having designed the buildings and optimized the components from the outset. And what's really important to note in this graph is also the resilience. So what this graph shows here is the projection up to the end of the century. And the high efficiency solutions to passive house provide resilience. So the cooling demand stays low, even as the climate heats up outside, we have resilience and we can provide cool conditions inside without a lot of energy input. Whereas buildings that are built to a lower efficiency standard are much more at risk to overheating and will drive the cooling need immensely. So I want to give you a brief insight of how we achieve this. What is the passive house concept all about? There's no time to dive into details. I'm happy to discuss it later, but basically it's a concept of a whole building approach, focusing on passive means. And what I've listed here on the slides are the main aspects. It's about controlling the heat and the humidity loads ultimately. So what's really important in hot climates is the shading, cool colors, keeping out the heat, the appropriate windows, the glazing ratios, and the glazing quality, so solar protective glazing. Insulation is an extremely important factor to keep out the heat, in the roof especially, but also in the walls. And then for the passive house concept, especially in hot and humid climates, air tightness and then mechanical ventilation with energy recovery is a core part of these solutions. And I think this is where passive house concept differs maybe from other approaches that focus on natural ventilation. Mechanical ventilation with heat recovery ensures that you have filtered and fresh air throughout, so it provides that aspect of comfort and health within the building, especially in urban settings with poor air quality. And the passive energy recovery core of these mechanical systems make sure that the heat and the humidity are kept outside. So these are a core part of the passive house concept. And what you see here as an image is a project in Dubai, an office building that was completed a few years ago and is performing very well with very low heating needs for operation. So I'm already coming to the end and wrapping up, sharing ideas with you of how we get there, how do we proceed from here. It's clear that the technology and the concepts exist in practice. There are more and more projects that show proof of concept, and we know that the cooling needs can be effectively and in reality reduced by 50% or even more. Here's another project that you see that was built in Sri Lanka with the monitoring data that shows energy reduction of 50%. This is actually a retrofit project and a clothing factory. So even for challenging projects, this concept can be applied. So where do we go next? What needs to happen? Just brief thoughts on that. We certainly need incentives and ideas to drive more projects and especially the regional market development. We can only make progress if we have the regional support and the regional market, the regional components available. Capacity building for designers, for builders to be aligned and to be building along these efficiency standards. And then I think there's still development needed, some research and some product developments in the sense of low load cooling technologies that efficiently address not only sensible cooling, but also the aspects of dehumidification. So those were brief thoughts from my side. As I said, the technology is available, the concepts exist, and we look forward to an uptake of this concept and more of these kind of projects with very low energy needs that really help to address the issue of ever increasing cooling demand and preventing lock-in. So thank you.
Jessica, thank you very much for your presentation and for sharing that interesting information on the potential of the passive house concept, among others. Continuing now on the same theme of building design, we turn to our next speaker joining us from India. Polash Mukherjee is lead climate resilience with the Natural Resources Defense Council, the NRDC India program in New Delhi. Polash is a researcher and policy advocacy professional in the area of environmental health and air quality management. In his work, he collaborates closely with the national, regional, and city governments in India on strengthening institutional capacities and building community resilience to climate disasters, including extreme heat. Polash is recognized as a strategic leader in the field of air quality management in India. Polash, thank you so much for joining us and our panel today. I invite you to jump right in with more on cool and climate-friendly buildings.
Thank you so much, Marian. And also thank you Thank you, Jessica, for that excellent presentation. I think it leads excellently into what I am here to speak about. Just give me a minute, sharing my slides. Yes, I hope this is visible.
Yes, perfect.
So, yes, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I am with the National Resources Defense Council. The NRDC is an international non-profit environmental organization that was founded in the US in 1970. We use policy, science, and the support of over 3 million members, individual members, to advance comprehensive solutions to today's biggest environmental challenges. What I'm going to speak to today is a little bit of what Jessica spoke about, and also what Gabriel was talking about earlier, about how some of our work addresses the equity component of cooling and on building community level resilience to extreme heat. So as many in this meeting may know, public health outcomes and energy demand around cooling represent a triple threat. The first is the threat to mortality and morbidity that is emerging from rising temperatures in cities in the global south. The case of India is especially an example here. The graph that you see on your screen is the number of deaths that happened during a heat wave in the city of western city of Ahmedabad in 2010. In just one summer alone, the heat wave caused more than 30 deaths, and since then the heat waves have only been rising, including this year, where the effect was more because it happened in the middle of a pandemic. Going forward, space cooling is likely to make up 70 to 80% of India's cooling energy demand by the mid-century, and this too was addressed before. Currently, the air conditioning penetration in India is estimated to be around less than 8%. So by 2050, space cooling demand is expected to grow by 8 times, and India's space cooling demand is expected to account for 30% of global emissions in this sector, much larger than the entire emissions of many countries. Adding to this, urbanization, rapid urbanization is something that most Indian cities are facing currently. According to the last census, India's population was close to 35% of India's population was urban. By 2050, this is expected to double. This means that it's been estimated that 70% of the buildings that will exist in 2030 are yet to be built. This only represents an opportunity for implementing ambitious energy saving standards, as well as active and passive demand reducers for cooling. Based on these threats, NRDC and our partners, we've been working on developing and implementing heat action plans. We started with the city of Ahmedabad, which has a population of about 7 million people back in 2015, with close to about 25% of the population residing in low-income neighborhoods. The heat action plan's focus is squarely on vulnerable communities and improving their health outcomes to extreme heat. How we do this is through a combination of implementing passive cooling technologies, cool roofs, I'll talk about that in a minute, as well as targeted health risk communication strategies to prevent exposure to extreme heat. The passive cooling technologies are retrofits, a combination of retrofits for existing buildings, as well as implementing energy efficiency standards in newer buildings. But the target group here is the low-income community, and therefore the Cool Roofs project specifically looks at the most vulnerable communities that are exposed to heat. They focus on building institutional and community climate resilience. And since 2015, along with our national partners, the National Disaster Management Authority. The heat action plans have scaled from the city of Ahmedabad to over 23 of India's 30 cities, as well as 100 districts across India. The cool roofs are a passive cooling technology that encourage solar reflection, as I'm sure many of you know. And because of the low cost of investment, these have been effectively deployed in communities at scale. Along with the reduced energy consumption, the thermal comfort effect of cool roofs is in our experience, is a big driver of its rapid scale up. NRDC and partners were able to deploy more than 3,000 cool roofs in low-income neighborhoods in Ahmedabad, and had a goal of 15,000 households, low-income households, in 2020 before the pandemic-induced disruption came into play. From a city-specific model, India is now moving towards a national cooling action plan, which represents opportunities for sustainable, equitable, and energy-efficient cooling for the future. The inclusion of passive cooling technologies such as the cool roofs is a big component of this, and we're hoping to include this in a big way in the state-sponsored, state-supported, low-cost housing projects. Our work in the city of Ahmedabad was recognized earlier this year through the prestigious Ashton Award for Sustainable Cooling. And this only goes to say that we have a long way to go, and cooling demand, passive cooling technologies like cool roofs can effectively determine the direction of our cooling demand. Thank you. Back to Mary.
Thank you very much, Pulash, for giving us a lot to think about, especially with regard to equitable building. We now move from cool building design to local cooling solutions, such as local building materials and vernacular integration strategies for architecture. To help us make sense of the concept and the terminology, Dr. Mei-Ling Loco is joining us from the United States. Mei-Ling is Director of the Building Sciences Program and Assistant Professor of Architecture at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in New York City. She is also the founder of Willow Technologies. Her research focuses on the upcycling of agro-waste and biopolymer materials into high-performance, clean building material systems that are used in humidity control, indoor air quality remediation, and water quality control. The company she founded, Willow Technologies, co-develops new upcycling business models between the global north and the south, and creates integrated material lifecycle design with a focus on generative justice. Mei-Ling, welcome, and thanks for joining us on what is a very early morning in New York. The stage is yours.
Good morning, everyone. All right, just give me one second to share my screen. All right. Oh, sorry, one second. Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. Just as the previous speakers have described, alongside this sort of global rise in cooling energy demand, it is important for us to understand how such drivers differ across the world and how these may also generate concomitant byproducts. Such drivers such as population growth, income rise, are tied up in the production of other resources. For example, population growth produces and requires more food to feed the growing population. For countries
Mei-Ling, I'm very sorry to interrupt you. Could you put the presentation in presentation mode? That way it's easier to see.
Oh, sorry. Yes, is that okay?
No, it's not in presentation mode yet.
You know what I will do? Okay, is that better?
No, it's still the same.
That is so weird.
There you go. Now it's presentation mode. Perfect.
Okay, so sorry. Yes.
No worries.
So just to recap, for countries that are situated along the equator, where we expect the world's population to continue to grow at rapid rates, and where cooling will be more expensive, what we've realized is one of the most underutilized resources that can serve as a renewable supply chain for cooling within buildings that has been overlooked is the use of byproducts from the agriculture or food sector. Today, it is estimated that about 2/3 of everything that we grow to put on our plate is actually wasted, most of which is downcycled prematurely or combusted in open air. And we believe that there are many other life cycles in between combustion, but from harvest to combustion, one of which is the deployment or the ushering of these materials into buildings. The integration of these materials as cooling thermal strategies are nothing new. We've used this in the vernacular architecture in many hot, humid climate types. But today's modern building sector and manufacturing industry are still yet to capitalize on the true potential for moisture control and temperature control within buildings. While there are a number of challenges, two of the biggest ones pertain to the type of work we need to do to rethink the production infrastructure for these materials. Because they are waste, they are produced everywhere, meaning they are distributed, and also because they are waste, they're of low quality, which means that our quality control needs to be thought and designed much closer to sites of production, as well as capitalize on that opportunity that Gabby mentioned to create jobs. The second challenge that may take decades to shift is the deeply seated social and cultural perceptions that are largely negative associated with upcycled building materials. Such perceptions are complex. They're not just a byproduct of the desire to modernize quickly using glass, steel, concrete alternatives, but are wrapped up in class stigmas of thermal adaptation, the fear of sweat, changing expectations of comfort. It's very hard to go back once you become used to air conditioning, and the simple cost of retrofit or maintenance culture, all of which require an intersectorial push beyond just the technical performance of these materials. One of the flagship materials that we've looked at is a byproduct of a multi-billion-dollar food and cosmetic industry in the form of the coconut husk, which forms 70% of the coconut fruit. What we see here is on the right side, this amazing capacity for these materials when they're developed into medium density fiber boards to absorb moisture within a vast internal matrix and hold that moisture during parts of the day where humidity is incredibly high. During other parts of the day, the sun as well as wind enable that material to release that vapor that is stored in their internal matrix, causing cooling. And so this phenomenon known as intrinsic evaporative cooling, which basically absorbs moisture from ambient humidity, is just one of the ways that our tools are beginning to catch up with the sophistication of vernacular strategies. But given the scale of this material resource availability that is so closely tied to the drivers for global cooling demand, including population increase, we believe that this is just one of many cooling product innovations that will bring in both the low and high tech as part of the cooling strategy for buildings. One of the greatest insights I've come to realize in this work is that no coconut is created equal. And so local ecosystems, business ecosystems are needed to deploy and scale these types of solutions. But the wonderful thing is that most of these materials have been conditioned. They've been grown to deal with the local demands of that context. And our job is to figure out how to transfer and translate that material intelligence that we see in these products as foods into our buildings. Thank you.
Mei Ling, many thanks for your insights on upcycling and on sustainable and potentially equitable cooling solutions. So important going forward. We now pull back the lens a bit to look at nature-based solutions for cooling, and our next two panelists will highlight two very different greening projects in two very different parts of the world. First, we hear from David Callow, the Director of Parks and City Greening, Strategy, Planning and Climate Change at the City of Melbourne in Australia. David has 2 decades of experience in landscape horticulture, and he's responsible for the management of Melbourne's iconic parks, open spaces, streetscapes, and ecosystems for current and future generations. David, hello and welcome. Please open your microphone, put on your camera, and tell us more.
Great, thank you, Marion, and good evening here from Australia. As Marion said, I'll be speaking about nature-based solutions for cooling and greening. Just going to share my screen. Okay, is that right to go?
Yes. Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Sorry, I can't see that screen.
We can see it very well, David.
Okay, is the title screen showing
Yes.
there?
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I'm going to talk about nature-based solutions for cooling and greening. And the first thing I'd like to talk about, and just going to the next slide now, is that showing?
Yes, it is.
Great. The first thing I'd like to talk about is the urban forest strategy, and using the urban forest as a strategy and a nature-based solution for cooling in cities. Melbourne has a critical issue with extreme heat. We know that the climate is changing in Melbourne, and we know that with climate change over the last 70 years, the temperatures increased by approximately 2 degrees within the central city area. We also know that the urban heat island is exacerbated by the central city. Sorry, which slide am I on there?
You're still on the same slide. It shows 2 maps of the city of Melbourne.
It's
My apologies.
Across jurisdictions, actually.
My apologies. Okay, I'll go back. Sorry, I couldn't see the slides. I'm on the first slide there now. Is that okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Just wanted to make the point that in the top right-hand corner there, it's an example of the urban heat island in the central city, and you can see that in that particular image there, that thermal image, surface temperatures are up to 30 degrees greater on those hard surfaces, as opposed to those the shade that you'll see underneath the trees. We also know that in testing in Melbourne has shown us that the urban heat island can increase nighttime temperatures to be 4 or 5 degrees warmer than the surrounding suburbs. In 2009, there was a heatwave event in Melbourne. Temperatures over a 5-day period were 12 to 15 degrees warmer than normal, and there were 3 days over 43 degrees centigrade. There was almost 1,000 deaths that occurred during that period, mostly elderly people, and there was a 25% increase in emergency cases. We know Melbourne's getting warmer, so how do we respond to that? For the City of Melbourne, one of the primary strategies is the urban forest strategy that was developed in 2012, and that's one of the main ways that we're adapting the city to climate change and the urban heat island effect. Trees, we know, are one of the most effective and efficient ways of cooling and lowering temperatures in a city. Our target in the urban forest strategy is a 40% tree canopy cover for the city, and that provides all of those shading, cooling and other environmental service benefits such as biodiversity and so forth. That's anticipated, the 40% canopy cover is anticipated to reduce those summer peak temperatures by several degrees. The image there in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, you can see it. In 2012, we're at 22% canopy cover. Our target is 40% for public land by 2040. Now, 40%, interestingly or notably, is you can see there the composition in that particular image on the right-hand side. 40% is primarily achieved through large canopy trees. To achieve large canopy trees, we need to have high-quality growing environments, and we need to be managing and maintaining trees for their healthy growth throughout their life cycle. So that's the strategy for the public areas within the City of Melbourne. One of the other key challenges we have is the private property that exists within the city. You can see there the pie chart on the right-hand side. The City of Melbourne only manages about 1/4 to 1/3 of the total land area within the city. The Urban Forest Strategy gives us strategic objectives for the next 20 years to achieve the cooling and other environmental outcomes. But how do we progress greening on private property? The two images there show the green cover over a 20-year period from 1988 to 2009, and you can see that population roughly tripled, but the green cover was reduced by about half. We know how important green cover is for cooling and shading. So how do we drive increased greening efforts on the private property within the City of Melbourne? Now, we have some incentive schemes that currently exist. And in addition to these, recently, even in this last month, the City of Melbourne has endorsed two new initiatives for greening on private property and for these nature-based solutions. The first, in the top half of the slide there, is a new planning scheme control that has been endorsed by the City of Melbourne, which is for mandatory building standards across the city for any new buildings. The new standards include ESD measures, waste, stormwater management, energy, urban ecology, water efficiency, sustainable transport, and the urban heat island. Standards draw on existing industry tools such as the Green Star standards. In the area of urban ecology, we saw that there was a gap. There was no clear way for Melbourne to assess urban ecology or greening outcomes on new buildings. And so we developed the Melbourne Green Factor tool. This builds on the existing global tools that are found for the cities of Seattle and Helsinki and other cities globally. The Melbourne Green Factor tool is unique in that it's been built for Melbourne and has a research base that looks at the key drivers for Melbourne and provides a weighting to different greening elements on new buildings. And so a developer, a designer can test those elements through the tool. It's an online web interface. And they can examine what their greening outcomes will be, and then there's a minimum requirement that's proposed in the planning controls, and a score that the Green Factor tool gives. The Green Factor tool is currently available in a voluntary capacity. We've had over 1,000 people register and are currently using that tool. And that's proposed to be one of the key elements of the sustainable building design controls going forward. Now, just to finish, I want to say that to deliver the critical cooling and greening outcomes across both public and private property within the City of Melbourne, it's important that our policy and strategy is able to bridge across both jurisdictions into the future. Thank you, Marion, back to you.
Marion, in case you're speaking, we can't hear you.
Yes, no, I was just trying to unmute, but I had a bit of a problem with that. Thank you very much. And thank you, David, for insights in how we can work in partnership with nature for cooling and greening our buildings and our cities. Again, such an important part of cooling solutions. We have the next speaker who will talk further on this theme. Her name is Yvonne Lynch. She is the Strategic Advisor, Royal Commission for Riyadh City in Saudi Arabia. Yvonne is an urban greening and climate resilience strategist who, since 2018, has worked on the development and implementation of the Green Riyadh project for the Royal Commission for Riyadh City. Green Riyadh is the world's largest integrated green and blue infrastructure project. Previously, Yvonne spent almost a decade establishing and leading the City of Melbourne's Urban Forest and Ecology team, garnering local and international innovation awards. It's a real pleasure to have you with us today, Yvonne. You have the floor.
Thank you. Hopefully you can see my screen okay.
Yes, we can.
Great, okay. Thank you. Today I'll speak about Saudi Arabia's Green Riyadh program, which is a major integrated climate adaptation program aimed at cooling Riyadh. And Riyadh is the capital of Saudi Arabia. This Green Riyadh program is just one of several ambitious environmental initiatives and well-being programs that are currently being rolled out under the Kingdom's Vision 2030 initiative. To provide a little context, Riyadh is actually one of the hottest cities on the planet. Today it's quite cool, it's 37 degrees or 98 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're just emerging from almost 4 months of consecutive days where the daily peak temperatures averaged between 44 to 49 degrees Celsius, or 111 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. So you'll understand when I say 37 is a little bit cool today. Riyadh has experienced extraordinary growth in recent decades. And as you can see on the map here, it was a small oasis in the desert in 1950 with a population of about 40,000 people. And today it's a sprawling metropolis with 7 million people. And what you might notice from these aerial images, particularly the one on the right, is that there's very little green cover. And this is very typically the trajectory for modern cities, that they grow, as they grow, the green cover is sacrificed for grey infrastructure. And I think David has demonstrated that point quite well in his presentation. So losing green cover is often considered to be a necessary trade-off for progress in urban development, rather than being considered as a vital asset or infrastructure within itself that needs to be protected. And this is something that's currently changing now in Saudi Arabia. The Green Riyadh project has been running for 2 years and it's underpinned by a comprehensive strategic framework, which I won't spend much time on. But out of that framework falls a significant number of transformative implementation activities for the city. We plan to create 3,300 new parks in the city over the next 10 years. More than 43 of those parks will be major city-scale parks. This is an unprecedented level of green infrastructure construction activity, which is currently unparalleled by any other city. These parks will be supported alongside the greening of 9,000 mosques, 6,000 schools, and most other public facilities within the city. Green or living roofs and walls are currently being trialled, and if they prove viable here, they'll be something that will be rolled out on a larger scale. All of the major roads, streets and highways will be greened, and to date we have planted around 133 kilometres of roads. To create the parks and green roads for the city, we calculated we need about 7 million trees growing actively in the streets, and planning for tree mortality, we're allowing for a total of 10 million to be planted over the next decade. A critical element of this project is the provision of water to enable such greening activities. We are just completing a master plan to build a sustainable water system to support these new green assets for the city. That system will consist of a wastewater treatment plant and a pipe network of about 14,000 kilometres moving in every direction across the city, with the capacity of supplying approximately 1 million metres cubed of water per day. If we get it right, and we create a strong green network of parks and a robust urban forest supported by a sustainable water supply, then we believe that we can actually cool the city's ambient summer temperatures by at least 2 degrees Celsius. So Riyadh is very much on a journey of transformation using green infrastructure and nature-based solutions for cooling. Greening the built environment is a critical element of cooling our cities. We need to support the capacity of our sustainable buildings by considering how both grey infrastructure and green infrastructure can coexist to create the best possible urban fabric for people and livability. When we look at urban development, adding new buildings to our cities, we need to consider what footprint we can provide for living infrastructure, for green infrastructure. Is there space for trees? Is there space for grass? It's not just about green roofs on the top of the building. It's about the entire environment surrounding the buildings. And this is really going to be what can optimize the cooling in our cities. Buildings can contribute also to water harvesting and supply water rather than just consuming for our environment. So what we need is to move towards more holistic approaches for cooling our cities, and certainly green infrastructure needs to be one of those. Thank you.
Yvonne, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. So many possibilities that you have raised. And now we will turn to the interactive part of this session. By the way, another thank you to all the panelists for sharing your diverse knowledge and your experience. You'll now have a chance to hear from our audience via the Q&A in the Teams chat function, where we have received a number of questions, some of them directed to all, some of them directed to specific panelists. At the same time, our audience, we also hope that you'll take a moment to participate in the Mentimeter poll by logging on to menti.com, where you'll find our polling question, and we'll share the results at the end of the Q&A. Let us turn now to our first question for the panelists. Let me just scroll up here. We have had a lot of response, and that is amazing. I am delighted. And here is a question for all the panelists. So I would ask whoever wishes perhaps to jump in and answer this to raise your hand. Here's the question. While the technology exists and there is a buy-in from governments, how do we scale this up to a level that makes a difference? How do we make it affordable and accessible to the urban poor, individual house owners? What incentives can we provide to make them invest in this? Thank you. Who would like to take this question? I think I can't see any hands raised, but perhaps I would like to ask Mei-Ling Loco to take this one. Mei-Ling, can you hear me? Are you there?
Yes, I can. I'm just trying to remember all the elements of the question.
Okay, I'll just repeat some parts of it, if I may.
Yeah.
So the key points, the key parts of this question are, while the technology exists and there's a buy-in from governments, how do we scale this up to a level that makes a difference? How do we make, I guess it's how do we make cooling affordable and accessible to the urban poor and to individual house owners? What incentives can we provide to ramp up investment in this?
Right. So from two ends, from both the, a lot of these affordable cooling technologies are alternatives at the moment, which means that the businesses that are developing these technologies are outliers, and they largely function in a culture or ecosystem of entrepreneurship. There is, on the other side of that, a lot of hunger and appreciation for local technologies. I've come to see cooling as a byproduct of that hunger and desire. If we can buy into that desire, then the cooling performance of these materials can be ushered in. And so how to have developed quite heavily this thriving business ecosystem is critical, not just as a feature in buildings, but as the cornerstone of their architecture. For me, I think that involves supporting and sustaining that ecosystem, recurring trade shows, conferences where that knowledge is built on and shared, taking capital to help these businesses thrive, and develop a much more expanded value chain so that they can adapt to changing markets and demands. So those are some of the ways that I think are critical, and that really focuses on supporting, businesses, entrepreneurs that are already developing these alternative solutions.
Great, thank you very much, Mei-Ling, and we'll move on. We have another question here. It's also rather a long one. It is no doubt that the presence of industrial buildings in both rural and urban areas makes the atmosphere hot and causes air pollution. What measures are being put in place to bring about a safety atmosphere and making the air comfortable for the inhabitants? Who would be best placed to answer that one? Do we have anyone who wishes to answer that question? So what is being put in place to bring about a safety atmosphere and making the air comfortable for inhabitants? Okay, Pulash, you have raised your hand. Wonderful. Please take the microphone.
Thank you, Marian. So to address that, I think there's a lot of initiatives that are happening in India to address the air quality. The one that is in context here would be to stop desertification. I mean, the city of New Delhi is at the edge of a desert, and we've been seeing a lot of green cover being lost over the years. So to bring in effective policies to stem the ongoing encroachment of wasteland and scrublands, which are viewed as wastelands, but which are effectively barriers against the encroachment of the desert. So that would be an important component. And adding to this, also I think some of the speakers spoke about the ventilation aspect and to address indoor air pollution. So to prevent recirculation of stale air and of the high level of resuspension of dust, especially and emissions, especially in densely populated urban areas, building design must be taken into consideration very strongly.
All right, Boris, thank you very much for that input. And I think from the same speaker, we have another question. And this one has to do with statistics. Are there any statistics or studies on cost mitigation, life cycle costs of reducing cooling loads in buildings via shading, white roofs, etc., in comparison to using technical solutions like efficient air conditioners, especially in existing buildings? Perhaps one of the nature-based solution speakers can take that one. David, would you be able to field that one?
Thanks, Marian. Just a couple of comments from me. There is a software product out of the US called iTree Eco. And iTree Eco allows the user to test the influence of trees and other nature-based solutions on the relative cooling costs for buildings. So that's a free software product. It's called iTree Eco, and it's put out by the US Forest Service. And that would be one way that you could test the various interventions.
Thank you very much, David. We now have a COVID-related question, and I think I will direct this one to Gabrielle. The question is how to guide post-COVID investment in buildings retrofits. Yes, in buildings and retrofits. And I think that's the end of the question.
Yeah, so this is where I'd also be interested in hearing from some of the other panels, in particular Jessica on some of the passive house solutions with ERVs. One of the consistent sets of messages that we're hearing from the World Health Organization, ASHRAE, the European REVA Federation, is that there's evidence that for reducing the risk of transmission in interior spaces, it's important to increase ventilation. Essentially, it's a dilution response. So in addition to hygiene and distancing, if you're in an indoor space, making sure that that air is well ventilated through either open windows or through higher air exchange with the outside is very important. And that also can include various forms of filtration that can remove particles. And there are also some forms of sterilization that can be incorporated. One of the really important things to note, however, is when you increase your ventilation, you increase the actual amount of air that you're moving in and outside of the building, which is a higher load to condition both for heating and cooling. So there is an energy, there's a higher energy related need. So having more efficient systems is going to be really important in managing that load as well. But I suspect that there are also other solutions that some of our speakers, panelists can speak to. But I would point folks to the ASHRAE and REVA website. So that's ASHRAE has a COVID resource page, and REHVA, REVA have a COVID resource pages that I would recommend people check out that are being updated.
Thank you. Do any of the other speakers wish to comment on that question? COVID-related question?
Yes, I'd love to have an opportunity. I completely second what Gabrielle just said. Thank you. I think one of the really important aspects is that we've learned of this whole situation is that we need to make sure that we have enough fresh air in our buildings. And that's something that's always been a part of the Passivhaus concept, that we make sure we have enough It's around 30 cubic per hour per person, fresh air supply to buildings from a health perspective. That's what we definitely need. And entirely agree with you again, Gabrielle, when you say the higher the airflow rate, the higher kind of the heat and the humidity that we bring in from the outside. So that's when aspects like the heat recovery and the energy recovery are really helpful, because they passively, so without any additional energy input, keep that humidity and the heat outside. And another aspect I think here to mention and to reflect on is that air recirculation is a huge risk, a huge health risk. So keeping viruses, keeping everything within the building for air recirculation is a health risk. And a lot of the conventional air conditioning relies on recirculation because we have such high cooling loads that we can only meet those with recirculation. If we really focus on energy efficiency and are really stringent on implementing all of these energy efficient measures, then we can bring the cooling load down considerably, that we can cover cooling load without needing additional recirculation. So I think that's also a point to keep in mind moving forward. Making sure we have a healthy air supply.
Absolutely topical. And there's another part to this question, and this is actually about financing tools. What are some potential policies and financing tools that can help deliver the safety and environment benefits of post-COVID green recovery in the building sector? Thank you very much. So potential policies and financing tools in place to help deliver the safety and environmental benefits post-COVID. Who would like to speak to that one? A little more technical. Gabrielle, please go ahead.
So I'm sure there are additional tools, but one that is being deployed right now is this cooling as a service business model, which is, in particular, if you have commercial spaces that are having lower utilization now, it's a good time to upgrade, retrofit your system. So I'm talking about the equipment here, and I'll turn to the other panelists to be able to speak more to the buildings themselves, which are going to probably use additional tools for the finance mechanisms. But the cooling as a service model is essentially a way to finance the upfront costs through the energy savings of the improved equipment. So cooling as a service, if you Google it, you'll find out more, is a model that's being deployed right now.
Thank you very much. And here is a question for all the panelists. And this again has to do with financing. How can national and local governments best support the uptake of sustainable cool buildings? Funding for best practice solutions, for example, passive house components, etc. And I wonder if we could perhaps hear from Yvonne about this. You're working on such an interesting project in Riyadh.
Sure. Okay, but for this question, I think I'll reflect on some work I've done in Melbourne years ago around financing sustainable buildings. I think part of the challenge for creating, especially retrofitting sustainable buildings, is actually the upfront cost. So while we know that the payback periods, they can be short, they can be 3, 5 or 10 years, but often it serves as a disincentive to the actual building managers or building owners to go and retrofit their buildings, because they don't want to pay out for that upfront cost. And access to finance is actually expensive for these things. So in Melbourne a couple of years ago, one of the things I did was work to introduce what's called environmental upgrade finance. And this was the first of its kind in Australia. And basically what that tool did was allow building owners who wanted to retrofit their buildings in some sustainable way, whether that was updating their aircon systems or putting in a green roof or whatever you can imagine, passive cooling systems, things like this. They would work with the city government to lodge an application on their behalf. The city government would apply to approved banks for the finance, and they would guarantee that finance for the companies. And essentially what happened then was the rate of financing was reduced so that they could get loans at really low cost, less than 1%. And they had a payback period that suited them. The local government was able to guarantee those loans with the banks, because in Australia we have a system of rate taxation on municipal buildings. So if you have own a property in the municipality, you pay a rate every year, and council can, if it wishes at any point, force sale a building if they don't pay their rents, something that's very rarely done. But that element within itself was enough to enable this really innovative financing scheme. And I think each city is different, each town is different, looking for those solutions locally. In what ways can local government step up and encourage building owners, I think is really.
We've just lost your audio, Yvonne. You're muted.
I think I've finished, yeah.
Ah, there we go. Thank you very much for that. And of course, these local solutions have to be applied around the world, depending on the need and depending on where they are being applied. And we have a question now, and we have time perhaps for one, maybe two more questions from our audience. And this one is about the importance of development finance institutions, not just initiatives, but institutions in accelerating mainstreaming sustainable cooling solutions. So the question is, what are your views on their importance? The importance of development finance institutions in accelerating mainstreaming sustainable cooling solutions. And this person has written in that he'd like to share a report. He has sent a link how DFIs, or development finance institutions, can rise to the challenge of cooling in a warming world. So this one is open to everybody. What are your views on the importance of development finance institutions? Do I have any takers for that question? Gabrielle, go ahead.
So I see this report was launched today, so I only had a quick glance at it. But one of the things that development finance institutions can do that private finance cannot is support the capacity building and policy environment that is so critical to getting the market and business environment right for a lot of these solutions. So I would very much encourage there to be a component of finance that in the development space that goes to helping governments put in place performance standards, labeling standards. We saw some of in the presentations from David, for example, some of the tools that are really essential for enabling consumers, builders at all to see the benefits and to then capitalize on those benefits for implementation.
Right, thank you very much, Gabrielle, for that input. And I think we will end with a question that goes back again to district cooling. And this is to all panelists. What could be the role of district cooling to achieve cooling targets? What could be the role of district cooling, which is actually an important component, I think, of achieving cooling? District cooling. Comments on that? Jessica, I see you smiling. Would you like to take that question?
Yeah, I was just thinking about what the highlights would be. I'm really not an expert on district cooling systems, so I'm not sure I can really answer the question in detail. I think the priority is really to bring down the demand, bring down the load at the buildings themselves, and then it's a little bit secondary as to what cooling systems we need in the end. And then there are different solutions, different efficient solutions that can be applied. And I'm sure district cooling is one of them that has very high potential. But the priority needs to be, first of all, to make sure that the cooling load and the cooling demand is low. We don't have audio.
Marian, you're muted. You're muted, Marian. I think Martina has her hand up, if I just may come in.
Okay, let me just see. Martina, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, have not been part of the panel, but happy to contribute a few words on district cooling. It is a really good opportunity to connect buildings, so not only to optimize the single building, but to look at the district level. And there's a whole host of issues that can be tackled by these district solutions. It allows us to use excess heat, for example, to use that for cooling. It allows us to bring in more renewables into the system as well. So it's something that's actually really, really powerful as part of a circularity approach as well. And indeed, connecting the buildings to each other. So I just wanted to chip that in as a contribution. Thank you.
Oh, that's lovely, Martina. Thank you very much. And with that, I think we have to move on to the Mentimeter poll. And I thank you all, the panelists, for your contributions right now and for taking those questions. I wish we had more time. Unfortunately, we are running out rapidly. So just stay online, but we will now just have a quick look at the Mentimeter poll before we go to the final summary and the wrapping up of this session. So here we see the screen. I hope you can all see it. Our question was, how can national and local governments best support the uptake of sustainable cool buildings? And many of you responded. So the highest number of votes went to question 1, focus on passive design. And that was a dead heat with focus on incentives, for example, financial procurement, and focus on locally adapted solutions. So those 3 answers garnered the most votes from those of you who participated. The least votes went to other, please explain in session. So that was pretty ambiguous anyway. Let's take a look at the screen once more, but thank you so much for participating. The sustainable element of this session is very important to us, and it is wonderful that you did take the time. Thank you again very much for that. And now, before we conclude with a brief summary of this session, I would like to thank all of you, our audience, for your excellent engagement, your participation, and of course, another special thanks to our expert panelists. You all presented such a broad range of ideas, trends, and solutions to the cooling challenges that lie ahead. And finally, of course, once more, hats off also to the session's co-organizers with the UNFCCC, the Global ABC, in collaboration with the Cool Coalition. And now we turn to a final summary of the main points to have come out of the presentations and discussion. Cool buildings for all. Here's a brief summary. Cooling trends and responses. Gabrielle from KSEP talked about cooling demand rapidly rising. Emissions from cooling will become similar to emissions by the entire United States. It's not just about efficiency, equipment, and air conditionings, but about reducing cooling load in the first place. So addressing building design is very important. And Gabrielle emphasized that we need to act now. The equivalent area of the city of Paris is built and constructed every week on this planet. In terms of building design, Jessica, Passivhaus Institute, she commented that rapid urban growth and growth-dense design buildings, she commented, on rapid urban growth and growth-dense. She said buildings have to be designed right from the beginning, designed properly and designed efficiently. Efficiency first, the shape, the orientation, and the components are important. There has to be resilience to reduce the cooling peak. She gave the example in Delhi that cooling demand and energy savings of 50 to 70% are possible, and the projections indicate resilience, that cooling demand can stay low. Controlling heat and humidity load is critical, and she said also that shading is essential, as well as glazing and glazing quality. So different aspects of passive design, such as mechanical ventilation, filtered fresh air throughout, and passive houses differ. Passive energy recovery, heat and humidity are kept outside. She gave the example of the office in Dubai, and the retrofit example of Sri Lanka, where there were 50% savings in that country. The way forward, she talked about incentives for regional market development, capacity building, for research and development, and low load cooling technologies. The overall message is that technology and solutions are available. So I remember that was a very optimistic, in a way, optimistic presentation. Polash from NRDC talked about cooling as presenting a triple threat: morbidity and mortality. The 2010 heat wave with more than 30 deaths is an example. He talked about energy demand. 70 to 80% of energy demands in India by the mid-century are due to space cooling, and 30% of global emissions occur in the sector. He also talked about heat action plans. The city of Ahmedabad focused on vulnerable communities. Passive technologies, he also mentioned cool roofs, retrofits, and energy efficiency standards in newer buildings, that they've been upscaled to 23 cities now. Cool roofs provide added thermal comfort, which is important for scaling up, with a goal of 15,000 low-income households in 2020 pre-pandemic. We'll see what happens in the post-pandemic world. India is moving to National Cooling Action Plan, 30 to 38% of cooling demand reduction by 2038. From Mei Ling, local building solutions, countries along the equator, and where populations will grow and cooling demand will grow. She talks about underutilized resources, the use of byproducts of the agriculture sector. A third of food is wasted, and that can be used for a cooling thermal strategy for buildings, an interesting technology. The challenges are the need to rethink production infrastructure. A quality control is also essential. She talked about social and cultural perceptions, the need to change them, perceptions and expectations of comfort. And air conditioning is perceived as essential. We need to push beyond technical performance. No coconut is equal. It was a lovely image. She said local ecosystems and markets are needed. And in the area of nature-based solutions, David in Melbourne talked about how temperature has increased by 2 degrees in the central urban heat island. That's up to 30% higher on hard surfaces compared to trees. In 2009, heat waves 20 to 15 degrees warmer than normal, 3 days over 43 degrees Celsius, and a 23% increase in emergency cases with over 1,000 deaths, a sobering figure. For the public area, he talked about urban forest strategy, that trees are one of the most effective ways of cooling a city, as we already know, and unfortunately we do not see enough of it. The target of 43% canopy cover for the city. He talked about reducing summer peak temperatures by several degrees, 40% through large canopy trees. Private property, the city only manages about 1/3 of city areas. And he talked about a new planning scheme, mandatory building standards for any new building waste management, urban ecology, urban heat islands, and drawing on existing tools. Yvonne from Riyadh, finally also talking about nature-based solutions, told us that Riyadh is one of the hottest cities on the planet. They have 4 months of daily peak temperatures at 44 to 49 degrees Celsius. She talked about growth from Oasis from 5 to 7 million, if I got that correct, or 50,000 to 7 million, excuse me. There's very little green cover. As cities grow, they lose green cover, and it's often considered a trade-off, but it is actually an asset. The Green Riyadh projects, which she described for us, include 3,300 new parks in the city, and more than 43 will be major city scale, unparalleled by any city. Greening of 9,000 mosques and 6,000 schools, green living walls being tried out, and all major roads greened, 133 kilometers of roads. And finally, she talked about 7 million trees that are needed, including tree mortality, which is around 10 million. She ended with the goal of a cool city by at least 2 degrees Celsius. We need to green buildings, gray and green infrastructure need to coexist, and we need to consider greening while planning cities and adding new buildings. It's all about the environment surrounding buildings, and buildings can also contribute to water harvesting, to water supply, and to the need for more holistic approaches. So that was a brief summary of some of the points that were raised by our expert speakers and our panelists, and some of their insights and some of their comments and solutions. With that, we unfortunately have to come to the end of this session on pool buildings for all. But we do hope to see you again next Wednesday at the same time for session 2 of the TEM-M-2020, Building Back Better, Mobilizing the Value Chain Towards Circular Economy. Stay safe, be well, and for me, Marion Canute, and the entire UNFCCC and Global ABC team, it is goodbye for now.